haven't painted much or had the motivation to do so lately, but sometimes something unexpected comes along that really boosts your motivation and can get your creative mojo flowing again.
I was digging through my pile of gray shame and stumbled across some sprues of old Chaos Warriors from Warhammer Fantasy, and was struck with a very unexpected hit of nostalgia. Funny enough, I also learned that they just re-released these for Old World. I remember when I first painted these, I primed them on the sprue with metallic primer, and always followed the box art scheme. I also never painted my bases, just bare plastic, baby.
These minis really excited me to paint again, and I think when motivation is low and you're not really excited about your current projects at the table, it can be really important to follow these threads of things that you're excited about to kind of help boost your motivation and get yourself back into the hobby again.
The idea that really excited me was painting these minis with all the new knowledge and creativity I possess now that I didn't have 10 years ago. God, I'm getting old. These minis are old. The poses are static as can be, but make me reminisce of the rank and file days of when I started playing in the end times. And boy, the mold lines are pretty bad on these. I'm excited to retain the beauty of Warhammer Fantasy while making these minis unique representations of each Chaos God with the skills and techniques I now possess. The first easy step in creating some unique and fun minis is some subtle and easy conversions during the building process. Be intentional about those weapon and helmet choices. My Khorne mini, I opted for a more traditional vibe with a simple dual axe look and a very corny helmet if you ask me. The Nurgle mini for me was also just some intentional building choices, with a warhammer and a bulky shield to represent that unrelenting resilience. And I thought the helmet would work well for some cool weathering effects I have an idea for. The Slaanesh mini was the toughest for me, but I thought the helmet fit the Slaanesh look, and I think the paint job will be where I can make it look more Slaanesh-y. The Tzeentch mini I did the most work on by making him a sorcerer. That ended up looking a little bit more royal than I meant to, but overall I'm pretty happy with it. Also, the skull in his hand, I want you to take a really good look at it, because you'll never see it again. I want these to feel like old world minis, just actually done in a more creative way, like I would now, as opposed to high school me, who just followed box art. The Tzeentch Warrior, I had a paint method in mind that I really like. If you have seen my Is 3D Printing Warhammer Wrong video, you'll be familiar with this method. And if you haven't, well, go watch it after you finish this video. I like to call this method the metallic slap chop. You base coat a mini with true metallic metal paint, usually a gunmetal, and then you take a contrast paint of choice and layer it over top. You get a cool colored metallic shimmer look. I chose blue of course for Tzeentch, but I think that this paint method speaks to the Tzeentch with the kind of shimmer effect as well. The armor is the standout part of the mini, so the fur and cloak were basic paint jobs. I also decided to do some subtle purple glow effects on the eyes to make it apparent that he's magical. Nurgle, in my opinion, is simple. At first, I considered some green ooze effects, but Nurgle warriors strike me as individuals who care not for adornment and only want to carry on to the next battle. So I gave him a pretty standard paint scheme of fur in the metal armor, and then a green cloak because Nurgle, and then a normal fur and leather texture. For me, I feel like the weathering is what matters for a Nurgle warrior. They don't concern themselves with maintenance, and they always feel old and deteriorating. I covered the entire mini in AK streaking grime, which will desaturate the mini and give it a nice grime look in the nooks and crannies. I let it sit in the streaking grime for about 10 minutes, but I think ultimately I could have let it sit a lot longer. I wiped away with a Q-tip and mineral spirits, and the desired effect is there. Now I really want to drive this effect home and mix together some orange and brown paint to have a pronounced rust effect. I would put this in all my recesses. And then on the shield, I use a little bit of turquoise paint to create an oxidization effect.
Now, you might say that this guy is kind of basic, but if you ask me, I think Nurgle tends to have a much more muted scheme and theme to them, and so I wanted to focus on desaturated colors and more very focused effects. I didn't want to drown it in a bunch of different effects and make it over the top, because I feel like Nurgle in general tends to have just a much more desaturated, reserved, muted look to them. And spoiler, this guy's actually one of my favorites of the four.
The Khorne warrior will follow a similar approach to that of the Nurgle warrior, a standard paint job with a special effect to establish the theme. I went the standard Slaves to Darkness scheme, and of course a red cloak for Red God, although the red we really care about is the gore. An effect I made great use of in my Grimdark Warhammer video was the gore and blood effects. Khorne is of course the blood god, and so it makes sense to use these effects. My 3 essential tools for gore effects are Veil Red contrast paint, Blood for the Blood God technical paint, and Yoo-Hoo glue. I will use all 3 of these in various ways to get different types of blood and guts effects. I made kind of a chunky blood and like sinewy tendon effect on the axes by mixing the Yoo-Hoo glue and the technical paint together and spinning it around the axes with a crappy old brush. Some touch up with just pure Blood for the Blood God technical paint can really push it home. The next effect was a blood spray, which I did by placing the Bale Red contrast paint on a toothbrush or a large brush and flicking it with your finger across the mini. Now this look may not be for everyone, but it just makes sense on a Khorne warrior for me. And be careful when you're doing this to not, splatter paint on the things behind it. My Slaanesh warrior does not have some crazy special effect or fun method like the metallic slap chop. The Slaanesh warrior, I just kind of had a clear plan in mind for how I wanted to paint it. I knew what would evoke the Slaaneshi way of excess. And now, what says excess more than entirely gold armor and a pink and purple cloak? I wanted it to feel and be gaudy. I also felt like the lighter fur color would stand out. I feel like if I had done a similar fur effect as I had done to the other minis, it wouldn't have looked as good. So I think it's always important to look at your mini as a whole and think how each piece complements the other. We have made our offerings to each god. Let us see if it's worthy.
Now, I painted these minis pretty fast, so if you wanted to recreate these schemes for an army of your own, I think you could do it pretty easily by following all the steps that I laid out today, as they did not take very long for each one. I'm excited to paint miniatures again, and I thought this was a really fun exercise to do. Now, I'm not making an army out of these guys, but it was fun to go down the memory lane with them and look back and use a lot of the different things I've learned along the way since I've looked at these miniatures in the past. I encourage you to experiment and look outside the box and go outside the box when it comes to painting miniatures and exploring new projects. This can be a good way to keep the hobby fresh for yourself, and a lot of times you end up learning something and growing and getting better at the hobby. So I think it's always important to follow these threads when they come along. Another thing is, it doesn't matter if you mess up. It's really easy to paint over these mistakes. At the end of the day, if we want to just re-prime the mini black, you can do that. So don't worry about making mistakes and getting experimental. There's always areas to correct that or paint over it. So really try to push yourself as much as you can. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. I have several more videos in the works that I'm excited to work on, as well as the continued effort on my Tyranid army and the Project Basilisk videos in general. So if you're interested in seeing all of those, make sure to follow along and look out for those when they come up. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, elevate your game night.